Helena Kingsley did not simply reject Elise Rowan's résumé. In front of the entire hiring room, the chief executive tore it in half, dropped it to the floor, and told the young woman that poor people ought to know their place. Elise did not cry. She only knelt and gathered every scrap of paper. And just as Helena ordered security to remove her, the boardroom door swung open. Grant Rowan, the single father the corporation believed had vanished for good, walked in beside the entire board. He looked at the chief executive's chair and said, "Stand up. My daughter is taking that seat." Press subscribe to follow how a résumé torn to pieces became the verdict that ended one arrogant chief executive's reign over a $9 billion empire, one page at a time. The lobby of Apex Meridian Aerospace was built to make people feel small, and on that gray Seattle morning, Elise Rowan walked across its polished stone, as though she had measured every inch of it in advance. She had come for the final verification of a selection process she had entered 6 weeks earlier under a sealed number, and the rules were plain, that each finalist arrive with a certified paper history because the committee refused to trust anything that lived only on a screen. She wore a plain charcoal suit, carried a slim folder, and did not glance at the wall of framed aircraft that the company used to remind visitors of its glory. She had promised herself, on the drive in, that whatever happened in that building, she would let her work speak first, and her name never, because she had spent 9 years earning a record that owed nothing to anyone, and she intended to protect that fact more fiercely than her pride. She knew what it would look like the moment someone connected her surname to the man who had once helped build the place. And she had decided long ago that the only answer to that suspicion was to be so plainly competent that the suspicion had nowhere to stand. No one in the hiring room knew who candidate N7 was, only that the plan submitted under that code had climbed to the top of every scoring round. They waited for a name, and when the coordinator opened the folder and read aloud, "Elise Rowan," the room simply noted it. Then the private Eleford Eft and Helena Kingsley stepped out, though the rules forbade a sitting chief executive from touching the final round at all. Helena crossed the room with the confidence of a woman who had never once been told to leave one. She asked to see the finalists' paperwork, and the moment her eyes found the surname, her expression changed, first into recognition and then into something colder. She asked whether Elise had any relation to Grant Rowan, and Elise answered directly that Grant was her father, adding that every part of her examination and her 9 years in the industry had been verified independently of anyone's name. Helena did not read a single line of the record in her hand. Instead, she began to recite the old story of how Grant had been forced out of the company years before, as though a man's departure were the only credential his daughter could carry. Beside her, Dorian Blackwell folded his arms and called Grant the mechanic who could not follow instructions, letting the insult sit in the air. Helena weighed the folder in her palm without opening it and let a thin smile settle on her mouth. She said that Apex Meridian needed leaders shaped in the boardroom, not people raised behind a repair shop, and she said it slowly so that everyone would understand it was meant to wound. Elise did not look away, and she did not raise her voice. She answered that a real leader ought to understand both the boardroom and the factory floor, because the second was where the promises made in the first were either kept or broken. The words landed as a challenge, and Helena heard them that way. She asked Elise, with open condescension, whether she truly believed she was fit to sit among the people running a $9 billion corporation. Elise let the silence stretch one beat before she replied, "I did not come here to sit among them. I came to repair what they got wrong." Dorian understood the danger faster than Helena did, because he had read the plan that candidate N7 had submitted, and he knew exactly what it demanded. The proposal called for an independent audit of every supplier whose contracts had ballooned over the previous 3 years. And those were the very contracts Dorian had spent those years quietly steering toward a firm his cousin controlled. He leaned close to Helena and murmured that this Rowan girl might be nothing more than a blade her father was pushing into the company to take it back. Helena had already made her decision before he finished the sentence. She lifted the folder, let her eyes drift across 2 lines without truly reading them, and then she tore the paper in half with a single deliberate motion. When Elise did not flinch, Helena tore the halves again and again until the certified record fell to the floor in a scatter of pale fragments. Several of the human resources directors looked at their hands, and not one of them found the courage to stop a chief executive in full stride. Helena said that people like Elise ought to be grateful merely to stand inside such a building, rather than dreaming of the offices above it. Dorian asked, with a small laugh, whether Elise needed cab fare back to her father's shop. Elise knelt and began gathering the torn pieces, and she did it not because she was broken, but because that paper carried the signatures of people who had once vouched for her, and those names deserved better than a marble floor. Helena read the quiet as surrender and told the room so. She ordered candidate N7's access revoked and called for security to walk the young woman out of the building. "You have no name, no family, and no chair waiting for you here," Helena said, letting each phrase fall like a stone. Elise rose with the fragments cupped in both hands and met her eyes without heat. "Then you should check how long your own chair is still guaranteed," she answered. Before the guard could reach her, the doors of the board's private elevator parted, and Rebecca Sloan stepped out with 4 independent members of the board and one more figure a half step behind them. Helena's face went pale, as though she were watching a man walk out of a grave she had personally dug. Grant Rowan looked first at the torn paper in his daughter's hands, then at the chief executive who had scattered it, and he spoke without raising his voice. "You just tore up the only thing that could save this company," he said. Helena recovered her poise the way a practiced performer does, and she laughed at Grant as though his presence were a cheap trick. She said that a man clinging to a sliver of stock had walked in off the street to stage a piece of theater for his daughter, and that no amount of sentiment would change who owned the room. Rebecca Sloan did not argue with her. She announced instead that the board was convening a special session under the emergency audit clause written into the company's own founding charter, and that Helena was required to attend. Helena walked into the boardroom and took the seat at the head of the table anyway, arranging herself there to prove that authority still belonged to her. Rebecca waited until everyone was seated, then set a sealed envelope on the table and explained that candidate N7 had finished first across all 3 rounds of the succession evaluation. The scores had been locked and certified before any identity was attached to the code, which meant no father's influence could have touched them. Rebecca read the results into the record without flourish. Candidate N7 had scored higher than every other finalist in crisis management, in cash flow restructuring, in the protection of intellectual property, and in the preservation of the workforce during a downturn. Helena insisted that a woman of 31 could not possibly run Apex Meridian, that youth alone disqualified her regardless of any test. In answer, Rebecca placed a second document beside the first, a report showing that Helena had concealed a shortfall of $180 million and had rerouted contracts without the board's knowledge. The room went very still. The independent members did not look at Helena. They looked at the numbers, and the numbers did not blink. The board moved to suspend Helena for 30 days pending a full investigation, and the vote carried 5-2. Under the succession plan already approved months earlier, Elise Rowan was named acting chief executive, effective at once. Helena gripped the arms of her chair and asked, in a voice that had lost some of its polish, "And who exactly do you intend to put in my place?" Grant stepped forward then, but he did not reach for the chair and he did not touch Helena. "The woman whose résumé you just tore up," he said. "Stand up, Helena. My daughter is taking your seat." For a moment no one breathed, and the only sound was the soft settle of torn paper as Elise laid the fragments on the polished table. Elise did not sit down. She set the pieces of her record in front of the board and asked that the minutes reflect a set of conditions before she would accept the title. She required that an independent attorney confirm the appointment, that her father take no part in the vote, that the full record of every score be released to the shareholders, and that she retain the explicit right to refuse any direction from Grant that created a conflict of interest. She spoke each condition plainly, and she watched Helena's face as she did it, because those 4 sentences dismantled the accusation of nepotism before it could be spoken aloud. If everything was public, if Grant never voted, if the scores stood on their own, then there was nothing left to whisper. Rebecca entered the conditions into the record without objection. Helena rose from the chair at last, but as she passed Elise, she leaned close and said, in a voice pitched only for her, "You may sit there today. By tomorrow there will be no company left for you to run." The threat was not empty, because Helena had prepared for the possibility of losing months in advance, and within minutes of leaving the boardroom she began pulling the levers she and Dorian had set. Dorian sent formal notice to the company's principal bank that Apex Meridian had breached the covenants on its credit line, a claim that was technically true and catastrophically timed. 3 suppliers announced within the hour that they were halting shipments of critical parts. A carefully sourced article appeared before noon, accusing Grant Rowan of using a fistful of stock to hand the top office to an inexperienced daughter, and across every feed the story spread that Apex Meridian had been captured by a bitter family. Elise was mocked as a workshop princess and a chief executive appointed by her father, and the share price fell hard before trading closed. Helena appeared on the evening broadcast wearing the face of a betrayed woman, describing herself as the victim of a clan that had seized a company it did not build. What no one watching could see was how calm she felt behind the trembling voice she had chosen to use, because to Helena this was not a crisis but a negotiation she had already priced out to the last dollar. She had grown up believing that the chief executive's chair belonged to her family the way a name belonged to it, an inheritance that a test and a sealed envelope could not lawfully touch, and she had convinced herself that any process reaching a conclusion she disliked was proof the process had been corrupted rather than proof she had lost. A woman raised behind a repair shop could not truly run a $9 billion company, she told herself, and if the numbers said otherwise, then the numbers had been arranged, and if the board said otherwise, then the board had been captured. It never occurred to her that she might simply be wrong, because nothing in her life had ever required her to consider it. Grant wanted to walk in front of the cameras and lay the evidence bare that same night, and Elise stopped him. She understood that an emotional answer delivered by her father would only convince the public that he was the true hand on the controls and she the ornament. She asked Grant to step out of the executive floor entirely and to serve only as a technical advisor summoned when a specific problem required his knowledge. It cost him something to agree, because every instinct told him to shield her, but he understood that his daughter needed to prove herself without his shadow across the room. He gathered his coat and left through a side corridor so that no one would photograph the 2 of them together. Elise turned back to the crisis alone and read the true position of the company for the first time. There were 4 days of cash in the accounts, 36 hours before the assembly line went dark, a defense contract on the edge of cancellation, and more than 4,000 jobs hanging on decisions she had held for less than a day. Helena assumed the pressure would break the young woman, that Elise would panic and resign before the week ended. Instead, Elise did the one thing Helena would never have done. She canceled the $2 million leadership gala scheduled for the following month, ordered the sale of the company's 2 private jets, and shut the executive retreat that swallowed money every quarter and returned nothing. The proceeds were enough to cover 3 additional weeks of payroll, and she announced the decisions herself, so that no one could claim they had been forced on her. Word moved down through the plant faster than any memo, and something in the mood of the place shifted, because the workers had never seen an executive cut from the top first. When Elise asked Dorian directly about the shortfall, he only smiled and gave her the answer he had been saving. "You can take the chair," he said, "but the safe underneath it has been empty for a long time." Elise did not fire Dorian, though every part of her wanted to, because she needed him where she could watch him, and she needed the evidence he carried to remain inside the building. She assembled a crisis team that did not look like Helena's old circle, gathering engineers, floor managers, an attorney, and a representative of the workers into a single room and refusing to let rank silence anyone. Unlike Helena, she did not run the company from a glass office suspended above the noise, and on her second morning she walked the length of the assembly line herself. Several of the workers recognized her, because before she had ever entered management she had spent years at a small parts plant that fought its way back from the edge of collapse without discarding its people. And a few of them had been there beside her. She did not ask them for their loyalty, and she did not promise them anything she could not yet deliver. She asked them instead what was slowing the line, and she wrote the answers down in a notebook of her own the way her father always had. One old machinist told her that the newest bearings ran hot and wore out in half the hours the old ones had lasted, and that everyone on the floor had learned to say nothing about it. On the floor she found the thread she had been pulling at from the start, that the most expensive components in the entire operation all came from a single firm called Blackwell Crown Systems. The prices ran 40% above the market, yet the quality sat below the standard Grant himself had written into the company's specifications years before, which meant the company was paying a premium for the privilege of buying something worse. It was the kind of arrangement that made sense only if someone were being paid on the other side of it, and Elise already suspected who. Dorian, when confronted, declared smoothly that the contracts had been approved by the board, and that Elise was welcome to review the signatures herself. She did review them, and she found the electronic marks of 3 directors, but the timestamps told a different story, because the signatures had been copied from earlier documents rather than freshly applied. She did not accuse anyone in that moment. She quietly requested an audit of the original source data, keeping her suspicion off the record until she could prove it. While she worked, Helena was on the telephone with the company's largest customer, telling them that a woman like Elise was not even qualified to sign the aviation certifications the contracts required. The customer gave Apex Meridian 24 hours to demonstrate that it could still be led at all. At a meeting with the bank the next morning, a representative of a fund called Ashcroft Dominion asked Elise, with a courtesy that was really a taunt, whether she needed to call her father in to explain the numbers. She answered by laying out a detailed cash flow plan on the table, line by line, and then she pointed out something the representative had not expected her to notice. The very debt they were discussing had been purchased by Ashcroft Dominion at an abnormally low price, the kind of price a buyer pays only when it expects the borrower to fail. "Are you here to save Apex Meridian?" she asked, "or to confirm that the company is weak enough for a takeover?" The Ashcroft side did not answer the question directly, which was its own kind of answer. That evening a set of records reached Elise that turned the ground under everything. A document showing that Helena had signed a secret agreement stating that if Apex Meridian ever lost the ability to pay its debts, its core patents would pass to Ashcroft Dominion. Elise drove out to her father's old inspection shop that night, past the industrial edge of the city, where the buildings gave way to low workshops and cold light, and she asked him why he had never told her the whole story of how he left Apex Meridian. Grant set down the tool in his hand and told her the truth he had carried for 12 years. When Helena had been a project director, she had pressured him to certify the Meridian X engine before it was ready, and he had found a flaw in its heat tolerance that could cause the unit to fail under extreme conditions. He explained it to her the way he had once explained it to a room that had not wanted to hear it, that the metal held its shape through every ordinary test and then quietly gave way under the loads no test bench ever bothered to reproduce. He had refused to sign the certification, and the refusal had delayed the flagship program by 6 months, 6 months in which the Kingsleys lost a launch window, and a great deal of money they never forgave him for costing them. The family had used the press to reshape him into a man who stood in the way of progress, a stubborn obstacle to innovation, a relic who could not keep pace with the future they were selling, and the label had followed him ever since. He told Elise that the worst part had not been the ruin of his name, but the loneliness of being right in a room that had decided to be wrong on purpose. After his wife died, he could not fight a legal war and raise an 8-year-old daughter at the same time, and he had made a father's choice, that a small girl who had just lost her mother needed a present parent more than she needed a vindicated one, so he sold most of his stock and walked away. But the co-founder who had built the company beside him before that man's own death had preserved for Grant 11% of the shares and a founder's right to demand an emergency safety audit whenever the company's safety or its assets were threatened. Grant could have used that right years earlier, and he had chosen not to because he did not want Elise to grow up living inside her father's war. She understood, finally, that he had not returned to take revenge. He had walked back into that building only when Helena humiliated his daughter and the company itself stood on the edge of being pulled apart for scrap. Grant handed her an old design notebook, its pages soft with age, and inside it was the list of the foundational patents that Ashcroft was maneuvering to seize. He warned her that Helena was not a foolish woman, and that a person like that always kept one last card face down on the table. Elise asked him quietly whether he truly believed she was capable of running the company, or whether he was only trying to make up for a past he could not change. Grant looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "I did not step in because you needed rescuing," he said. "I stepped in because they needed to be stopped before they took away your right to prove yourself." She turned the pages of the notebook and found something that made her go still, because the governance principle at the heart of her own Project North Star, the idea that engineering had to be protected from the manipulations of finance, was the same principle her father had written into those pages 12 years before she was ever handed the test. He had not slipped her the answer. The two of them had walked separate roads and arrived, independently, at the same conclusion. Then her phone rang, and a voice from the plant told her that the inspection system had been locked, that hundreds of millions of dollars in finished equipment could not leave the floor, and that the account name attached to the lock command was Elise Rowan. It was a trap built with her own identity, and Dorian had constructed it with the patience of a man who had done this kind of thing before. Within hours, Helena stood before whatever cameras would have her, demanding that the board reverse the appointment and restore her to the chief executive's office. And the story that Elise had deliberately halted production to manipulate the stock ran everywhere at once. Rebecca Sloan had no choice but to convene an emergency hearing, and Elise was given 6 hours to prove that she had never issued the command that bore her name. Grant found the first thread quickly, that the account had been created using Elise's employee code, but the security signature attached to it came from an older generation of device. That generation had only ever been issued to the executive team, and every one of those units had been distributed before Elise had joined the company at all. Dorian tried to erase the server logs to bury the discrepancy, and he did not know that Grant had once designed an offline backup that could not be altered after the fact. Elise refused to let her father stand alone and present the evidence for her, because that was exactly the picture Helena wanted painted. She built the timeline herself, laying each fact in sequence like parts on a bench. The account had been created 3 days before she ever took office. The lock command had been scheduled from within the chief financial officer's own suite, and Dorian had accessed the server during the very window in which he had publicly claimed to be in New York. When Dorian sneered that the data could easily have been forged by Grant, Elise did not argue. She asked that the digital records be matched against the building's entry logs and the corridor cameras, and the footage showed, in plain gray light, Dorian handing the old device to Helena's personal assistant. In the hearing room, Helena tried the same knife she had used from the beginning, calling Elise the girl who always needs her father standing behind her. Elise turned to Grant and asked him to leave the room before she presented the final piece. He hesitated, and then he went, and the door closed behind him. Alone, with no one to accuse of pulling her strings, Elise proved the account had been forged, named the man who had created it, produced a copy of the agreement with Ashcroft, and traced the clean financial motive that ran straight back to Helena's own future. There was no father in the room to credit or to blame, only the evidence and the woman presenting it. "You tore up my résumé because you did not want to read it," Elise said, meeting Helena's eyes across the table. "Now you are losing your chair because you never read anything but the praise written about yourself." Before the board could move to remove Helena permanently, Dorian delivered the last card, announcing that Ashcroft Dominion had bought enough of the debt to force Apex Meridian into bankruptcy by the following morning. Exposing Helena was not the same as saving the company, and Elise understood that the true fight had only shifted ground, from her name to the debt now sitting in Malcolm Ashcroft's hands. Ashcroft made his offer with the smoothness of a man who had done this many times, that he would pay off the entire debt and even let the Apex Meridian name survive, in exchange for the patents, the main plant, and the right to cut 60% of the workforce. Several members of the board wanted to accept it, because bankruptcy frightened them more than surrender did. Helena, working from the shadows, quietly promised to help Ashcroft complete the takeover if she were kept on as an honorary chair, trading the company's future for a title. Elise had less than 12 hours to find another road. She went back into Project North Star and divided the company's assets into 3 groups: the core assets that could not be sold under any condition, the luxury assets that could be liquidated at once, and the side projects that could be spun off to raise fresh capital. Grant offered to put up the whole of his personal stock as collateral, and Elise refused him. She would not save the company by making her father lose everything a second time, not after watching what the first loss had cost him. Instead, she reached out to 3 of the largest customers and offered them a portion of their contracts prepaid in exchange for stable long-term pricing, a deal that would give Apex Meridian cash today for a promise held steady over years. 2 of the 3 refused outright. The third made a single demand that the company prove its assembly line could actually run before dawn, and the line was still locked behind Dorian's sabotage. Grant and a small team of engineers went to work restoring the old control build from the immutable backup while Elise sat across a table from a regional bank and argued for a bridge that could carry the company through the week. Word spread through the plant that the new chief executive had pledged that not $1 of any rescue would go to executive bonuses, and the workers began to stay past their shifts, not on orders, but because for once the sacrifice was starting from the top. The hours before dawn moved with a strange doubled weight, slow inside the plant where every minute of restored machinery felt like an hour, and impossibly fast against the deadline that would not bend. Elise did not sleep, and she did not pretend to, moving between the engineers bent over the old control build and the small conference room where the regional bank kept asking questions. She answered without hesitation. Grant worked at the far end of the floor with his sleeves pushed up, saying little, coaxing the immutable backup to surrender the settings Dorian had tried to bury, and twice the screen went dark before it came back. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, a floor supervisor told Elise plainly that if the line was going to fail, it would fail in the next hour, and she thanked him for the honesty and asked him to stay anyway. The turn came from a place no one at the top had ever respected. Dorian had cut the budget of the inspection department for years because it produced no revenue that showed on his reports, treating the people who kept the aircraft safe as a cost to be trimmed rather than the reason customers trusted the company at all. It was that same overlooked department, working through the night, that discovered a revised production process capable of cutting costs by 18%, exactly the margin the third customer needed to see before committing. The line came back to life an hour before first light, and the prepayment was wired against a running machine. Apex Meridian secured its financial commitment 17 minutes before the deadline expired. Then Helena, watching the rescue take shape, declared the entire arrangement void, insisting that she still controlled the Kingsley family's voting bloc and that no deal could stand without it. Helena called a shareholder meeting, certain that the family's shares combined with Ashcroft's would be enough to overturn the board and undo everything. She arrived in a tailored suit, composed and gracious, working to rebuild the image of a capable leader wronged by ambition. Elise walked in carrying the résumé that had been torn apart and then taped back together, not to apply for anything this time, but to lay evidence in front of the people who owned the company. Helena accused Grant across the floor of using his daughter as a front, of interfering in a sealed selection, and of manufacturing chaos so that his family could seize the company cheaply. Rebecca answered by releasing the full anonymous scores of the entire succession program into the record, every finalist and every round. An external auditor confirmed, on the record, that Grant had not known candidate N7 was Elise until after the final scoring was complete, which meant the accusation of a rigged contest simply had no floor to stand on. Grant rose and told the room that he would take no office and would buy no further shares, that he wanted nothing the company could give him except one thing. His single demand was that the independent safety charter, the one Helena's family had gutted years before, be restored in full. Elise then presented the evidence that Dorian and Helena had colluded with Ashcroft, the forged account, the copied signatures, the secret patent agreement, all of it laid out in an order no one could misread. Malcolm Ashcroft remained confident even then because he believed the patent transfer deal had already taken effect and that the crown jewels of the company were as good as his. That was when Grant revealed the last thing, the card no one on the other side had known he held. The foundational patents did not fully belong to Apex Meridian at all. Under the original founding agreement, the company held only the right to use them, while any transfer of ownership required the consent of both founders or their appointed trustee, and Grant had never signed. The clause had been written into the earliest papers of the company for exactly this reason, so that no single leader in a moment of ambition or panic could sell away the foundation that everyone else stood on. And the men who wrote it had understood something the Kingsleys never had, that the most valuable thing a company owns is often the thing it is most tempted to trade away in a crisis. Ashcroft's own attorneys had never thought to check the chain of ownership beneath the patents because it had never occurred to them that a man dismissed as a failed mechanic might be holding the one signature that made the entire scheme impossible. Helena and Ashcroft had spent months trying to sell something they had never owned, and the takeover collapsed in an instant, every projection and every promise built on it turning to paper in the same breath. Helena turned to Grant and, for the first time, asked to negotiate. He did not raise his voice. He reached into his coat, took out the scraps of the résumé Elise had once been made to gather from the floor, and set them on the table in front of the entire meeting. "You had your chance to negotiate," he said. "When my daughter walked in as a candidate, you chose to humiliate her instead." The room was silent. Then, before the shareholders could move to a vote, Elise asked her father not to use his veto to decide the outcome. She wanted Helena removed by an independent tally, by the free choice of the people in the room, and not by the special privilege of a Rowan, because a victory handed down by family would be no different from the throne she was fighting to dismantle. Grant agreed without argument and rose from the section reserved for major shareholders, walking to the back of the room so that his presence could not weigh on a single vote. Elise stepped forward and presented the 90-day plan in full, the rescued cash flow, the customer commitments, the restored inspection department, and she made one thing clear to every person listening. No one, she said, not even the Rowan family, held any right to treat Apex Meridian as an inheritance to be passed down. The small shareholders who had spent years afraid of Helena began, one after another, to move their votes. The workers' representative confirmed that Elise had protected jobs while selling off the privileges of the executive class. The largest customer stated plainly that it would continue the relationship only if Elise kept control of the company. When the tally closed, Helena was removed permanently, Dorian was dismissed, and his file referred to the investigators. The Ashcroft arrangement was voided, and Elise was confirmed as chief executive for a 2-year term subject to an independent review every 6 months. Helena stood at last from the chair she had always treated as family property, and as she gathered herself she turned to Elise with the only weapon she had left. "You won because you carry the Rowan name," she said. Elise met her without anger. "You tore up my résumé because you saw my name," she answered. "The people in this room just voted because they read what was inside it." Then, in front of everyone, Elise did something that told the whole story of what she intended the office to mean. She did not sink into the oversized chief executive's chair. She asked that it be removed and replaced with a chair like the ones the rest of the board sat in, because power was meant to carry responsibility, not to sit on a throne. Grant watched from the doorway, saying nothing, as his daughter ran her first full meeting without needing him to walk in and rescue it even once. 6 months later, Apex Meridian had steadied itself. The contracts with Blackwell Crown had been canceled. The independent inspection department had been rebuilt and given real authority, and the company had returned to profit without a single mass layoff. Elise declined to place her father on the board, precisely to avoid the conflict of interest she had promised the shareholders she would never allow. Instead, she brought him on as a technical advisor engaged project by project, with a written contract and clearly defined limits on what he could and could not touch. Grant took a quiet pride in the fact that his daughter had not turned her victory into a new dynasty, that she had won the throne only to refuse to sit on it as one. Helena, meanwhile, faced a line of civil suits and a financial investigation that would not be waved away. There was no easy scene of forgiveness, no soft absolution, because the consequences she met had grown directly from the choices she had made with open eyes. In her office, Elise placed the taped-together résumé inside a small glass frame, and she hung it where she would see it every day. She did not keep it to remember the humiliation. She kept it to remind herself that competence does not vanish simply because a powerful person refuses to read it. Grant, visiting one afternoon, offered to replace the frame with a finer one and to have the torn pages restored so the seams would not show. Elise shook her head and told him that the tears were the most important part of it, that a clean copy would say nothing at all. She told him that a person who only ever saw the clean version would never understand what it had cost. and that she wanted to remember the cost, not to nurse the wound, but to keep it honest. Grant did not argue with her, because he recognized in the answer something of himself, the same refusal to smooth over a truth, simply because the truth was uncomfortable to look at. They walked down together to the plant floor on the day Apex Meridian shipped its first engine built to the new safety standard, the standard Grant had once lost his chair defending. The floor was loud and bright and full of people who had stayed through the worst of it, and more than a few of them nodded to Elise as she passed, not because she was the chief executive, but because they had watched her sell the executive